for just a few minutes and then get into our study for the evening. Isaiah chapter 55 is a famous passage, but it kind of ties in with the story that I shared with you just a few moments ago about how God was working in this young man's life in the hospital. Somehow the word got to this church and they began to show love to this young man suffering with cancer in the hospital, and he gave his life to Jesus Christ. But the family was still not saved. The mother was still not saved. The sister, the little girl, no more than I would say maybe 9 or 10 years of age, if that. But God in His sovereignty was working. And in God's will, God's way, He sent a lady from Henderson to that park bench in Bryson City to talk to her. And I pray that all of us will remember this verse that I'm about to read, because sometimes you wonder, I'm sharing the gospel with people, I invited them to church, and then nothing happens, no one comes. No, we are simply doing one part in the gospel presentation. Like the pastor at the church in Asheville told Pat, he said, it's amazing that you did what you did, because it's like what the Bible says. Some sow, some water, and some do the harvesting, but God is the one who is behind it all. Listen to what it says in Isaiah 55, verse 11. So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it. Now God is saying these words in Isaiah chapter 55. He is calling people to Himself, and He is giving them this promise that the word that goes forth will not come back void, will not be ineffective. When you truly share about Jesus, when you truly talk about God, when you truly tell the gospel to somebody, you may not see it, it may not happen in your lifetime, but somehow, somewhere, you are part of the harvest. I remember years ago, somebody gave me the illustration of a spider web. It's like a web of salvation. You have only one strand of that web. You may not have all the strands, but at least one. And all of us are coming and putting that one strand onto that web. And before you know it, someone is about to get caught. Someone is going to get stuck on that web and get saved. That's what it's about, folks. Isn't that what Paul said? Some sowed, some watered, but God is the one who gave the increase. So my challenge to you is share the gospel. Sometimes you're going to use words. Sometimes you're not going to use words. Sometimes it's going to be kindness that leads to words. But don't walk away doing nothing. Are y'all with me? Do something. Do some act of the gospel to touch someone's life. Tonight we're going to finish something in this series. This is not the end of the series, because the harder part is still to come. And I'm kind of holding off on the hard part because I feel that's a tough one. I want to do it right till the end, so if everybody walks out, at least I'll get the last stuff in and end the series, okay? So I don't want to do the hard part too early. But tonight is in a way I'm bringing it from the King James Version to today's translations. Kind of finish that gap, okay? So let's begin by recapping what we learned, not last weekend, but last Wednesday, but the Wednesday prior to that Wednesday, because we've missed 2 weeks now. If you remember, we talked about politics and the English Bible. How the translation, it's amazing. People have their politics, people have their agenda, but God's agenda is still moving. There was an agenda in England by a man named King Henry VIII. What was his agenda? Anybody want to help me with that? What was his agenda? He wanted to have a son. And for some odd reason, he could not have a son. Well, we know what that reason is, but he could not have a son. So he went through how many wives? 6 wives. All right? If you remember the little ditty we mentioned, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. I think that's what that's how it went, I think. So he went through 6 wives, but he had an agenda anyways. So let's look at the recap that I have over here for you. Henry VIII commissioned the Great Bible. Okay? Then the kingdom passes from him to Edward VI, his son. He was a Protestant. Henry VIII sometimes was Catholic, sometimes was Protestant. It all depended on what was, his mood. But Edward VI was definitely more Protestant. He opened the door for the Bible translations to happen, and tons happened in the short time that he ruled. But he died, and his sister came to power. Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary, came to the throne. And was she Catholic or Protestant? Roman Catholic. What did she do? Why was she known as Bloody Mary? Because she killed a lot of Protestants, right? And so that happens. Then she was succeeded by her sister, Elizabeth, who was a Protestant queen. So she reversed what her sister had done. So all these things are happening. And at the same time, there's another translation that is being developed known as the Geneva translation that was being done outside the country in Geneva by the Puritans. They started making their own translation. What else happens? When Elizabeth comes to the throne, she commissions the Bishop's Bible. All these things, by the way, are in your notes, so you have them all right there in front of you. I'm just kind of recapping. She comes to the throne, she commissions the Bishop's Bible. They take the Great Bible and do some changes in it. It's the Bishop's Bible. Where does the Reims Dewey Bible come from? It's the Roman Catholics' Bible. When Elizabeth comes to the throne, the Roman Catholics have to run, just like the Puritans had to run when Mary came to the throne, and they came up with the Geneva Bible. The Roman Catholics came up with the Reims Dewey Bible, based on the names of the places they had to run to. What happens next? Elizabeth the first dies, and James the Sixth of Scotland becomes James the First of England. He becomes the new king of England. And he had held a court in 1604 at Hampton. Had a council at Hampton Court where a motion was made for a new Bible. He was happy for that because he did not like the Geneva Bible. Why didn't he like the Geneva Bible? Anybody remember that? Because the Geneva Bible, kind of talked down about the kings, the divine right of kings. And so he didn't like the Geneva Bible, all the notes in there about God is our king. So he wanted to do away with that Bible. And so he was for this new translation. So they began to, he commissioned this authorized version. That's what the King James Bible is about. And I've given you some things here about what this translation was going to be like. Not too wooden, not as much word for word, right? It needs to make sense. There are no word for word translations. I mean, some come close, but it's not possible. Old ecclesiastical words like baptism and church were to be retained. Why do you think that? Because the Anglican Church, still when it comes to baptism, they sprinkle. So if you say immersion, you're going to get them in trouble. So they said, leave it baptism. Let's stay as cloudy as possible on that subject. Church should be congregation, but they said, no, church, let's keep the old name is better. It needs to be formal. All right, so those kind of things he retained. He emphasized that need to be in there. No notes, so they cannot attack him. No notes in my Bible, no notes. Still had the apocryphal works. And sometimes people say, I like the old King James. Then he must like the old apocryphal work too, because that was in the King James Bible. They took them out later. Something else, they also had the Douay-Rheims translation by then, so they also brought some of the Latinisms from that translation into the King James. See, a lot of times when people get passionate about the King James, they don't think about the real story behind it. They did bring in even the Catholic Bible and consulted that in their translation. Even though it departed frequently from the Tyndale translation, the revisers of 1881 and 1885 returned to the original rendering. So when you talk about the King James Bible, and this is a New King James right here, you're really talking about Tyndale's translation is what you're really reading. Remember Tyndale? What did they do? Anybody remember what they did to him? They did what? They burned him at the stake. That's right. Y'all are listening. Until recently, the King James has been the most popular version of the English Bible, but it's kind of changing now. Okay? Now, let's look at some of the main translations and a little bit about them. If I could stand here and talk on and on, it'll take me days. All right? And no one has time or motivation to sit there and listen to how each Bible and who was behind it and where it come from. We'll be here for the whole week. So I'm using two books. One is Geisler and Nix's book, A General Introduction to the Bible, and the second one is this book right here, Paul Wegner's book, The Journey from Text to Translation. These are good books if you ever want to have some in your library. These are the ones to have. All right, so let's look at this. The King James became the standard translation, but not for everybody. When the King James first came out, this authorized version, most people liked it, but not everybody liked it. The Geneva Bible. Who made the Geneva Bible? Anybody remember that? The Puritans. Remember when Mary came to the throne, all the Puritans ran out. They made the Geneva Bible in Switzerland. For the next 50 years, the Geneva Bible was still popular. It's not like King James comes on the scene, everybody's like, man, that's what we've been waiting for. No, people still kept reading and republishing the Geneva Bible. They still liked it. In fact, Shakespeare used Geneva Bible a lot. You can see it in the translations that Shakespeare uses, compare it. A lot of Geneva Bible is in there. Listen to what this scholar by the name of Hugh Broughton said. It's in your notes. Listen to how he says it. This is Elizabethan English, Middle English. He says, the late Bible, right worshipful, was sent me to censor, which means was sent to me to promote, to recommend. He says, which bred in me a sadness that will grieve me while I breathe. It is so ill done. Who is he talking about? What is he talking about? He's talking about the King James Bible. He said, it is horrible. This is a guy at the time. He said, it is horrible. Then he says, tell his majesty, that I had rather be rent in pieces with wild horses than any such translation by my consent should be urged upon poor churches. So tear my body into pieces before I tell the people to read the King James Bible. When did this person say this? In 1611. So not everybody was in favor. They didn't like it. They said, it's okay. It doesn't do it for me. So what happens? There was a major revision in 1629. And again in 1638. So if you really, when people say, oh, I like the King James 1611, you don't have the King James 1611. Now you may get it in the library. I have a copy that they put out some time back, but that's not the one that you, by the way, we'll come to that in a moment. It's definitely not the one that y'all are using if you're using King James. The 1611 was revised in 1629 and again in 1638. A lot has changed in it. Now listen to this. In 1762, Dr. Thomas Paris revised the spellings and added marginal notes. And this is from Cambridge. This guy was in Cambridge. He did this. In 1769, Dr. Benjamin Blaney revised the King James. Would you like to know how many times? It's in your notes. Y'all read it from me. How many times? 75,000 times. Means that's how many places it doesn't look like the 1611, the original one. Yeah, of course. He revised the translation. What people have today is not 1611. It's been revised and revised, and 75,000 times, that's a lot of revision.
It would take a couple of months just to keep up with that.
Well, this guy is from Oxford. It became the Oxford Standard. It's these guys were brilliant. We think we know a lot, they knew a lot. And when he was revising, he was like, this doesn't sound right. Change it. He changed a lot. So be careful when you say, oh, King James, is that what y'all use, 1611? Because that's what I use. They're not, either they don't know what they're talking about, or they don't know what they're talking about. That's pretty much it. Now, with each passing century, people were becoming more dissatisfied with the King James. Why do you think they were getting dissatisfied? Language is changing. Let me give you some examples from Wegner's book of how it used to sound like way back. I hope I can find some. Let's see. And again, this is not an attack on King James or any of that. I use New King James, so we're going to come to that issue later on. But let's see if I can find some of the words from early editions right here. Okay, here we go. Mean man. When you say somebody's a mean man, what are we saying? In 1611, it meant a common man. What do you think it means today when you say someone is mean? It's not. It's cruel. You're hateful. All right. How about the word cherish? In 1611, the word cherish meant to keep warm. What do you think it means today? To care about someone, right? Back in the day, when you say passenger, y'all help me. What do you think the word passenger means? A rider. Back in those days, passenger is somebody who's passing by. That makes sense, doesn't it? A passenger. How about the word prevent? Keep from happening. Back in the 1611 King James, it meant to come before. The word let. Let means what? To allow. Let it go. To allow. Do you know the word let in 1611 meant prevent? Wealth is money, right? Isn't that what we think? Wealth. But back then was welfare.
Oh, that's still true today.
Yeah, it is. You're pretty right. Somebody is forward. Forward means they're very assertive. I mean, they say, they come forward and say it. Forward back then meant ready or willing. I mean, you can see the meaning there somewhere in the midst. What do you think the word knit means? K-N-I-T, knit. To weave. Back then it meant to let down. How about some of these? I would love for our brethren to use this translation. Genesis 25:29. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. Sawed. I don't know how you sawed something. S-O-D. We don't have that word anymore. Exodus 19:18. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke. Job 26:5. Dead things are formed from under the waters and inhabitants thereof. Psalm 5 verse 6. Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing. Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing. Ecclesiastes 2:25. For who can eat, or who else can hasten hereunto more than I? Do you talk like that? So even back then people were going, we don't like the way this sounds. How about Luke 17:9? Okay, I'm going to go to New King James. Okay, Luke 17:9. It says, does he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I think not. Here it is, I trow not. T-R-O-W, trow not. I mean, anyways, give you an example of why they felt like, there are words here that are no longer commonly used. Words like almug, code, capped, habergen, hosen, cab, ligger. These are words we don't have anymore. Ouches. Now I know what an ouch is, but there's a word called ouches. Anyway, so you get the point. They felt like it had to change. And it did. Okay, so in the 19th century, some people were becoming dissatisfied with the King James because of old renderings, developments in biblical studies and linguistics, and discovery of old manuscripts. And we're going to come to that subject week after next, the manuscript issue. So keep that in mind. So this is what happens. If you have your notes on the screen, I'm giving you each Bible at a time. So in 1881, the English Revised Version was published, and the entire Bible was published in 1885. First the New Testament, then the entire Bible. Altogether, 65 revisers of various denominations were part of the project. What do you think they're revising? The King James. They're revising the authorized version. Some people were disappointed over the changes. And furthermore, changes from the Greek text of Westcott and Hort were also incorporated. I know some of y'all going, who is that? 2 weeks from now, you will know who those people are. Okay? We'll come to that. That is the real depth of what the translation is about. So all that we've been arguing so far is surface. The real depth is the manuscript behind it. The text was released 5 days before the Revised Version, which is RV and ERV, same thing. Okay? How many changes in there? As many as 5,788 changes were made from the Greek text. You've heard me talk about Charles Spurgeon, right? The famous pastor. He called it strong in Greek and weak in English. He had a way of putting things in perspective. It never truly replaced the King James. So, the King James that we're really reading, I think it's more 1769. Does that make sense, folks? Not 1611. I have a 1611 in my office. I promise you, you won't be able to read it, but so far, before you go, what is that word? What are they saying? 1769 is what we're really reading. But they tried to revise it, which is the English Revised Version, which really did not fly. Then comes the American Standard Version in 1901. So let me tell you about this. Go back to the very top, okay? When the committee in England was putting together the translators who would help revise the KJV, they decided to ask their brethren across the pond, which is people in America, the scholars in America, to help them. Now, y'all help me teach. We Americans, I can say that, we Americans do not like these and thous and old King's English. So what do you think the American translators and scholars said to the British? What do you think they told them? Y'all speak up. I'm sorry? They probably told them it's not.
They probably wanted to change the wording.
They wanted to change a lot. The American scholars said, we got to change more than this. People need to be able to read this. You English need to loosen up. What do you think the English did? I said, no, we're not going to loosen up. In fact, we're going to keep it as it is. We're going to change a few things. They said, well, we have our notes over here. We have all these notes that we have made where I think our translation may be better than what y'all are doing. They said, for 14 years, you cannot touch it. So for 14 years, they were under contract to not publish anything of their idea on how the English Revised Version could be better. What happens 14 years later? If you do the math, 1885 to 1901, how many years is that? Yeah, 14, 15 years. 14 years later, they started on the American Standard Version, which is revising the English Revised Version. Are y'all still with me? I wouldn't have that much patience. I would have just said, you know what, y'all can sue me. I'm doing what I want to do. It was better received in America than the Revised Version in England, but it still did not overthrow the KJV. Next comes the Revised Standard Version. The New Testament comes out first in 46, and the entire Bible in 1952. Have you heard of the RSV? This is the RSV. What did the RSV do? It was based on the critical text. Now, underline that word, that phrase, critical text, because we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. What does that mean? Because, folks, here's the funny thing. Most of the time, what people are arguing over is surface stuff. This is the real debate. All people argue over is, well, I like this because this sounds godlier, and that sounds more heavenly, and this is... You're talking surface stuff. The real stuff is underneath, which is the critical text versus the textus receptus and all of that. We'll come to that. So the RSV was the first translation based on the critical text, means that it was not exactly like the Greek and the Hebrew behind the King James. So far, the English Revised Version, American Standard Bible, were still close to the King James original languages behind the scene, but now they're shifting away. The National Council of Churches was part of this Revised Standard Version. So sometimes people say, oh, liberals, they're all liberals. You got to be careful how you say that, because you'll be surprised who were using the RSV. You heard of Donald Gray Barnhouse? Very fundamentalist, very Bible-believing. He was using the RSV. And many others like him. Did some liberals use it too? Of course. But you cannot always quickly call everybody a liberal. Okay? Be careful about that. Then comes the New American Bible. The New Testament came out first in 1941. The entire Bible came in 1970. Y'all have the notes in front of you. Who's behind this Bible? The Roman Catholics are. They finally decided to say, okay, we need to have another translation in English. When was their last one? Y'all remember the Douay-Rheims? Back in 1600s? Which was revised, by the way, in 1750. This one was, here we go again, based on the Vulgate. They didn't go to the Greek and the Hebrew. This kind of stayed where they were. But there were some improvements that came later on in the Old Testament and all that. Then comes another translation known as the New English Bible. If you ever seen, have you read books, and if you open the front cover before you get to the content page, you'll see this, right? And you see NEB and all those, those titles there. These are the Bible they're using. The New English Bible, what is it? It was the first translation to completely move away from the King James Version. It has been popular in England more than in America. Then comes another Bible. Which one is this one? The Jerusalem Bible. Who is behind the Jerusalem Bible? And what's the difference this time? Say it again. They are now not going to the Vulgate, they're going to the Greek and the Hebrew. So how many years did it take them to really say, okay guys, we have to go past the Latin to the Greek and Hebrew? Not until 1966. Okay? And again, by the way, how many of y'all have heard of J.R.R. Tolkien? Oh, okay, good. You know, you watched Fellowship of the Ring and what's the first one? What's the first one? Fellowship of the Rings. Okay, Return of the King and all that. Now, this is the man who wrote it. He was instrumental in the Jerusalem Bible translation. Interesting, isn't it? By the way, what do you know about J.R.R. Tolkien? Something very interesting about him. I'm sorry. Might as well. Nobody else is answering. How many of you have heard of C.S. Lewis? C.S. Lewis. J.R.R. Tolkien was instrumental in C.S. Lewis getting saved. Interesting, isn't it? So, anyways, be slow to hate people. You never know. Sometimes we quickly label people and say, that's this and that's that. Be slow. You never know who else is in that same bunch, and you're attacking everybody and calling them heretic. What comes next? How many of you heard of the Living Bible? How many of y'all have the Living Bible? Some of you do. The Living Bible, New Testament came out in 1967. The entire Bible came out in 1971. It was translated by a man by the name of Kenneth Taylor. What is it? It is a paraphrase of the ASV. What is the ASV? Let's see how many of y'all are actually paying attention to your notes. American Standard Version 1901, right up on the top. You get it now? This is a very important sheet to have. I don't know of anybody who has this. So hang on to this sheet of paper. I have summarized all the major translations. Now there are other sheets out there, but they are like, 10, 20 pages. You don't have them on one page. That's the advantage of this one here. So, no, I'm not the only one doing this. It's just I'm condensing it. What happens next? How many of you heard of the Good News Bible? Remember those stick drawings? As a little boy, I used to love in church, sit there and look at all those pictures. And then I would draw eyes and mouth and nose to them.
When I was a kid, it was a big deal in our church.
Yeah.
They gave those out a lot.
Yep. And because, why do you think they gave them out a lot?
They were easy to read, I guess, maybe? They were kind of, they were
Dirt cheap. They were dirt cheap. Because they did that on purpose so that it would go to a vast audience. And millions of people got. I mean, I had several copies back in India in my home of the Good News Bible. Also known as the Today's English Version. But I love those drawings, the stick figures in there. Let's see. The New Testament came out in 1966. The entire Bible came out in 1976. What did it do? It attempted to simplify the words used in the translation. Now something happens. What is a something? A Bible comes on the scene. Changes the landscape forever. What the Bible is? The NIV. It has become a rival to the King James. No other Bible has ever achieved that. You know, all the other revisions that we've been looking at, they all came and they just kind of like, they came. The NIV comes and boy, it stays. And there was a big battle because what did people say? Man, it's full of heresies, is this and this and this. You got to be careful how you call people heretics because you may not agree with some of the translations, but there are people who are very godly who are using NIV and preaching the truth. Okay? So be careful how you call someone that name. What was the NIV? It came, in the New Testament came out in 1973. It's a very special year. The entire Bible came out in 1978. And then it was revised in 1984. The NIV that most people have is the revised one in 1984. It attempted to bridge the gap between two word for word and kind of readable. So it kind of found that middle place. How many of you heard of the New American Standard Bible? Does anybody know anybody who is famous who uses the New American Standard? Who is it? John MacArthur uses the New American Standard a lot. Okay? So, it was published by the Lockman Foundation, a nonprofit Christian corporation. What was it? It was a revision of the ASV. What is the ASV? The American Standard Version, which was released in 1901. But it was not just like, oh, let's just put New American Standard Bible on top of it and sell it. No, they translated it again. So they made it more. But here's the problem with the New American Standard Bible. It is not pleasant to read. It's so, it's very cut and dry. It loses, how many of y'all like to memorize from New American Standard Bible? You don't. It just doesn't flow as well. So that is the New American Standard Bible. Again, it was based on the critical text. I'm not going to talk about that today because we don't have time. In 2 weeks, you'll hear about the critical text. What does that mean? All right. What happens next? Now comes the New King James. New King James. By the way, I don't know how to break it to you. Go back to the RSV. Y'all there? Way on the top of the page. The RSV. Remember that? The critical text. 1946. Entire Bible in 1952. That was my first Bible. was the RSV. Go figure. Right? I'm still saved. Yes. Just want to make sure people know that. Right? All right, so now comes the New King James Version. New Testament came out in 1979. The entire Bible comes out in 1982. It was based on the Textus Receptus. Just like the word critical text, we're going to also talk about the Textus Receptus. What does that mean? What do those things mean? Because, folks, that is the real question when it comes to translation. It revised the King James, and it tried to modernize the translation. I like it. Most people here like it. It's easy to understand, right? And I'll explain more on those issues next time. Like I told you, I don't have a favorite translation. I don't think there is a translation that is word for word. They all have paraphrases in them. Okay? So there is no perfect translation. John? Oh, guess what's calling me? The church alarm system. Isn't that great? It's lovely. We're here. All right, what comes up next? Look at the next one. The New Revised Standard Version from 1989. It was again sponsored by the National Council of Churches, and again it tried to revise. Which one do you think it tried to revise? The RSV, right? Now let's go to the last one here, the last block. How many of you heard of the Message? Nobody? Oh, okay, some of you have. How many of you have heard of the Message being in the news lately? One person asked. Who is the person behind the Message? Eugene Peterson, right? Eugene Peterson was recently asked the question, what does he believe about gay marriage? And he said, I'll do it. I'm fine with it. No problem. And all of a sudden, Christian leaders from everywhere are saying, we're pulling your stuff off the shelf now as you're speaking. He said, well, come to think of it, I don't believe in that. Can I get my stuff back on the shelf? Amazing, isn't it, how quickly money changes convictions. That was a disappointment to me. I respect the man. I mean, his translation is not literal, it's not word for word, and he'll tell you that. It sheds light, it's idiomatic, it's based on the 1990s. I think it's already old now. All right? It's the Message Bible. It kind of sounds good in places. But when it came to his convictions, that was a shame. But when confronted, if he really was a man of his word, he should have said, oh, no, I stand behind it. But he said, no, I take it back. So it's kind of has been smoothed over. What can you say? What's the next one? The New Living Translation. How many of you heard of that one? I have that, and it's a good translation. It is a thorough revision of the Living Bible. Again, I'm telling you, hang on to this list because these are the main Bibles. There are many other Bibles, by the way, folks, hundreds more. But these are the main ones. The other hundreds didn't work. At least these ones are still around. Okay? That's why I'm giving you this list. It came out in 1996 as a thorough revision of the Living Bible, again by the same man who did the Living Bible, Kenneth Taylor, and the Tyndale House publisher. It is a functional equivalent translation and not a paraphrase. Paraphrase is like The Message by Eugene Peterson. New Living Translation is not a paraphrase. It is more than a paraphrase, but less than modified literal. If y'all remember those. Now comes English Standard Version. What is the English Standard Version 2001? By the way, who do you know uses the English Standard Version? Have you heard of John Piper? Uses the English Standard Version. A lot of lot of Reformed guys use English Standard Version. Wayne Grudem, if you heard that name before, he uses English Standard Version. Is it a good translation? It's based on the critical text, and we're going to learn the difference between, I keep pointing to a blank board, that doesn't help, to the critical text and Textus Receptus. Or majority text, or the eclectic text, the heart of how to pick the best Bible translation is here, not in what you're reading. This is the real issue. And I'll explain this when we get to that. And that's when you're going to say, oh, so why are we arguing over this? This is what we should be debating. And this is the hard part. Okay? So ESV is again based on this. So just to help you understand, where does the King James and New King James fall? It falls here. Okay? By the way, I could have put this over here because they're the same thing. The rest of them are kind of branching out in these categories. What's the last one there on that screen is the Holman Christian Standard Bible. The Holman Christian Standard Bible came out in 1999, and in the entire Bible in 2004. There were some issues where copyright and this and that was happening with the NIV, with the TNIV coming out. A lot of issues were going on there. That's when Southern Baptist, they said, well, we're going to get our own publishing house to get a translation out. That became the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Again, which one is it based on? More on the critical eclectic text. You'll know what these things mean in 2 weeks. As of 2016, what is it called? Christian Standard Bible. So if you see that, some of y'all might find a HCSB, and some of you find the CSB, and you go, which one is, what's going on? It's the same Bible with some revision. Now it's known as the Christian Standard Bible. Lastly, y'all remember this? We talked about this about 4 studies ago. The TNIV that came out in 2002, and it wanted to be a little bit more gender inclusive, based on sort of like what they were doing to the NIV in England, the NIV International. How was it received? Not very well, because there were a lot of things that they were doing in the TNIV that people felt like, I think you compromised. I think you're changing. And in some places, yeah, it was being compromised. So people tried to defend it, they tried to argue for it, and all that went back and forth. Ultimately, the NIV came out with 2011. So if you go to the Lifeway store or any store and you want to buy an NIV, you're not buying 1984. You're buying 2011. Which did what? It went back to 1984, tried to change what they had changed in 2002 and made it more like 1984. But in many places, I don't think they changed it back like they should. That's my opinion. I think they should have changed it back to the 1984. They messed up there. My opinion there. Now, there are many other translations, but these are the major English ones. Anybody have any questions before we close in prayer? Yes, ma'am. So are the rest of them. They just pretend like they know it all. Oh, great question. That's a great question. Depends. The old King James did not have the same order that you have today. I'll cover that in one of the lessons. And also, how many books are there? Because in the Catholic Bible, you're also dealing with apocryphal works that we don't include in the King James, New King James, or some of the other NIV, NASB. We don't have apocryphal works. Where are they getting it from? I explained it one time, because they're going back to the Septuagint. We're going back to the Hebrew instead of the Greek translation of the Hebrew. I'll try to explain that a little bit better. That's a great question. That's a great question. How many books and what's the order? The order has changed. It's amazing, the order has changed.
And when were they split? Some books were actually split.
Yeah,
There were only one book at one time.
I guess so. In the early church, I mean, we're going back way back, the four Gospels did not go together. Why? Because there was no need for them to go together. They were going to different churches. So how we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all together, they were never like that. There was a copy of Matthew over there. There's a copy of Mark over there, Luke and John here. And when you look at when they began to put them together, they're not always in the same order. The orders are different. And even the order of the Paul's letters, what we call the Catholic epistles and all that, they were not in the same order. They were all over the place. I'll explain that as well. Now it is pretty much standardized. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Did the Catholic Church become an organization?
Right. At what point did the Catholic Church themselves organize? Like, before it was just churches and
Well, if you want to go by a definite date, that's hard to do that. But if you go by just observation in history, it's obvious to see. What is the empire? Who is in control? Rome is. And what's the capital of Rome? There's the city of Rome. And so the Bishop of Rome is the head honcho. Right? So he becomes the main powerful guy. Not the pastor in Jerusalem or the pastor in Alexandria or the pastor in Antioch. I mean, these were also major sees. If you know what I mean by sees, S-E-E-S, major churches, bishoprics. But the Roman one became very powerful because he is the emperor's pastor. I'm kind of simplifying it. That's where I think it all began to change. But other people have other ideas on that as well. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit too. Anyone else? Great question, by the way. Those are, I've taught before and people don't ask those questions. Yes, ma'am. Quakers? I guess we're going back to, what's the guy's name? Maybe Dwight, you want to step in and help there? And that, William Penn, but yeah, he was a Quaker, but it goes before him. Here's my thing. After the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Reformation, church was no longer monolith. It was not just one established church. So you had people getting the Bible in their hands, and they're interpreting it the way they want to. Much of the Anabaptist movement came out of that kind of thinking that we can interpret it. We don't need a priest to help us get to God. Okay, that was the main thing, because we have the words of God in our hands. That's one of the basic differences between the Catholic Church and the Protestants or the Anabaptists, which are not really Protestant, they're separate. So that's the major difference. The Quakers, again, you feel the presence of God. You don't need a priest to help you get to God. These movements began in the 15th, 16th century. Now, some people say those kind of movements were always there. You go further beyond the Anabaptists, you come across the Waldensians. You come across the Lollards. You come across other fringe movements that were always there that believed that the Roman Catholic Church is not the main church, that we don't need to do that. But they also had some weird, creepy beliefs too at times. So there's sometimes people say, oh, I trace my line not from the Catholic Church, but from these movements. It's like, do you believe everything like they did? Because, no, you don't want to. Back in the early 90s, late 1800s, there was the trail of blood kind of theology, that the trail of blood began way back there with John the Baptist and Jesus, and it comes all the way down. So here's the Catholic Church, but here's another church that's always been there. There have always been people who believe the truth, but I don't think you can draw a straight line through them. Okay? But with the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, people began to read the Bible and they began to come up with beliefs. Quakers came out of that, Mennonites, Amish, all these groups. And it's deeper than that, but I hope I answered it. I don't think I did. Dwight didn't help me at all. I was looking to my Mennonite brethren to help me. It didn't come through. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you today for this time of learning and